That moment would become known in leaked diplomatic cables as the beginning of Operation Exodus, a covert program ordered from Washington. It began on a night when the sky had no light, no moon, no stars, just a low hum of engines slicing through the clouds. A cargo plane, unmarked and silent, descended onto the tarmac of Ouagadougou International Airport. No transponder signal, no manifest, no call to the tower. Only the blinking lights of military vehicles waiting below. When the rear ramp opened, a line of exhausted faces stared into the African night. Nearly 300 people, shackled at the wrists and ankles, barefoot, terrified. A Burkinabè officer stepped forward. "Where are these people from?" he asked. The man in the black cap, speaking with an American accent, replied, "They're yours now." Operation Exodus, a covert program order from Washington and coordinated through private contractors and diplomatic intermediaries. Its purpose, according to a whistleblower from the U.S. State Department, was to repatriate stateless migrants and undesirables to partner nations in Africa with or without consent. But this time, the plan met resistance not from Western NGOs or foreign courts, but from within Africa itself. Because standing behind that Burkinabè officer was a man who had grown tired of humiliation, who believed Africa was no longer the dumping ground of broken empires. He was the president of a small, landlocked nation, a former soldier who had seen the price of obedience and the cost of silence. And when he heard what happened on that tarmac, he made a decision that would ignite one of the most defining moral confrontations of the decade. In a televised address that would later go viral across the continent, he said, "We are not a landfill for the world's mistakes. People are not leverage. We will not be the last stop for the forgotten." That statement shook the foundations of global politics. Within days, the African Union called an emergency session. Leaders from across the Sahel, West Africa, and even parts of Europe quietly began asking the same question. Had the West finally crossed a line it could not walk back? The alleged existence of Operation Exodus seemed almost too dark to be true, yet the evidence grew. Satellite footage verified the unmarked flights. Local journalists from Jeune Afrique and Le Monde Afrique confirmed unusual night landings in Ouagadougou, Niamey, and Bamako between late August and early September. And a leaked document published by an independent collective in Paris, Les Archives Libres, claimed to detail the terms of the operation. Burkina Faso to serve as regional intake for unregistered migrants of Middle Eastern and African descent intercepted in European transit zones. In other words, people who had no passports, no nations, and no rights. The same document cited that the program had the implicit approval of American intelligence and European border agencies, using humanitarian aid as leverage. The language was bureaucratic, sanitized, but the meaning was unmistakable. Africa, once again, was being asked to carry the burden of others' failures. It was not the first time. The continent had long been at the receiving end of Western experiments, from IMF structural reforms that gutted public services, to military interventions that left power vacuums filled by insurgents. But this was different. This was human cargo people treated as unwanted inventory in the global balance of power. For many Africans, the news triggered a collective memory. They remembered Libya in 2011, when NATO bombs fell and migrant routes exploded in chaos. They remembered how Europe fortified its borders, how tens of thousands drowned in the Mediterranean, and how millions more were trapped in limbo, neither accepted nor returned. In Ouagadougou, thousands took to the streets within days of the leaks. They held signs that read, "Humanity is not collateral," and "Africa is not a trash can." Others simply chanted the president's words. People are not leverage. Internationally, reactions were mixed. The United States denied involvement, calling the allegations misleading and politically motivated. The European Union issued a carefully worded statement expressing concern about misinformation regarding migration cooperation. But human rights groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch demanded an inquiry, pointing to consistent testimonies from witnesses who saw unmarked flights and detained migrants near Ouagadougou and Niamey. Independent fact-checkers, including Bellingcat Africa, analyzed flight radar data, uncovering multiple aircraft with military-grade transponders temporarily disabled a violation of international aviation law. The registration numbers matched aircraft previously used by private contractors linked to U.S. defense operations in North Africa. Even without full proof, the story resonated because it fit a pattern. Across Africa, leaders were beginning to question why Western powers always seem to act as judge, creditor, and savior all at once. Why were African borders treated as zones of convenience for global politics, while African lives remained expendable in international decision-making? In a world reeling from refugee crises, debt traps, and geopolitical proxy wars, Operation Exodus became a symbol not just of injustice, but of awakening. For decades, Africa's leaders have been divided by ideology, religion, and outside influence. But the scandal, real or imagined, triggered something rare: unity through shared indignation. The presidents of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, already allies to the alliance of Sahel states, declared that they would not host a single undocumented migrant without full legal oversight and international accountability. The rhetoric was fiery, but the symbolism was profound. For the first time, African nations were refusing to absorb the moral consequences of Western failures. As the weeks went on, foreign media framed the story as a test of Africa's new assertiveness. The Guardian described it as a moral stand in a cynical age. Reuters reported that several African embassies in Europe began recalling envoys in silent protest. Meanwhile, across the Sahel, murals began appearing with a simple message painted in red: "We will not disappear." Then, something extraordinary happened. In a small classroom in Ouagadougou, a 9-year-old girl, the daughter of one of the detained migrants, wrote a letter that would later be read aloud in Parliament. If people can be lost like luggage, then the world is not a home. Her words spread faster than any diplomatic memo ever could. Within days, those words were trending across African social media, translated into dozens of languages from Swahili to Hausa, from Arabic to French. They became the heart of a movement that refused to die. And so began Africa's reckoning, a confrontation not just with foreign powers, but with a deeper question of what it means to be sovereign in the 21st century. When the first leaks about Operation Exodus hit the press, many dismissed them as conspiracy. After all, the idea that hundreds of stateless migrants could be offloaded into a sovereign African nation, while consent sounded like something out of a Cold War thriller. Yet within days, fragment of confirmation began surfacing from unexpected corners, fragments that turned fiction into something uncomfortably close to fact. A former logistics officer attached to a West African regional air traffic control unit spoke to the Intercept Africa under condition of anonymity. He confirmed that several unregistered cargo aircraft have been given priority humanitarian clearance by external authorities, a clearance code normally reserved for disaster relief flights. But there had been no flood, no famine, no official emergency. What there had been, he said, was pressure. We were told not to ask questions. Orders came from above, from people who don't wear uniforms. Meanwhile, investigative reporters from Deutsche Welle's African Bureau cross-checked satellite imagery showing temporary detention compounds erected near the outskirts of Ouagadougou. The structures appeared between August 29th and September 2nd, exactly the window when the flights allegedly landed. Local villagers said trucks arrived at night, their headlights off. By morning, nothing remained but tire tracks and silence. International reactions followed familiar lines. Washington denied everything. Brussels called for restraint. Paris remained notably quiet at silence, as loud as an admission. But inside African capitals, something had changed. For decades, Western governments had treated African cooperation as a given, purchased through aid packages and security pacts. Now, those same governments found their calls unanswered. Within the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, an emergency council met for 14 straight hours. Generals, ministers, and legal advisors debated what to do with the migrants now stranded on their soil. Should they accept them quietly, risking moral complicity, or return them, risking confrontation with a global superpower? The president listened more than he spoke. Witnesses later recalled him saying only one line that night: "If we do nothing, we confirm what they think of us, that Africa will take anything." By dawn, the decision was made. Burkina Faso would formally reject the transfer. All detained migrants were to receive immediate medical care, and an international investigation would be requested to the African Union Commission on Human and People's Rights. That announcement, delivered live on national television, electrified the continent. Across Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Ghana, spontaneous rallies erupted in support. Hashtags like #AfricaIsNotADump and #OperationExodus trended for weeks. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. In a single act of defiance, a small West African nation had told the most powerful government on earth that its moral authority no longer held sway. But resistance came at a cost. Within 48 hours of the broadcast, foreign aid negotiations stalled. Several international NGOs announced temporary operational suspensions. Western media outlets began portraying Burkina Faso as unstable and anti-Western. Analysts on global networks used familiar language, authoritarian populism, isolationist rhetoric, anti-democratic drift. Yet inside Africa, those same words were being reclaimed as expressions of dignity. For the Sahel Alliance, the loose coalition linking Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the controversy became an unexpected opportunity to forge a new identity. These were nations already scarred by terrorism, sanctions, and poverty. Yet, for the first time, they shared a common narrative not of victimhood, but of resistance. Joint statements soon followed. The three governments demanded a comprehensive audit of all bilateral migration cooperation agreements with Western powers. They argued that any deal allowing external actors to relocate migrants without consent violated both the Geneva Convention and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Legal scholars from the University of Pretoria and Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar supported the claim, noting that even temporary custody of migrants required explicit sovereign approval. The issue had crossed from politics into law and, inevitably, into the court of public opinion. Across Europe, activists seized on the scandal. In Berlin, members of CBRUC and pro-ASIL staged protests outside the U.S. Embassy, holding banners that read, "Not in our name," and "Africa deserves justice, not dumps." The Guardian published an editorial warning that, if proven true, Operation Exodus would constitute one of the most egregious human rights violations of the decade. Within the African Union, momentum built for a continental response. A proposal circulated to create an independent tribunal that could prosecute crimes related to forced displacement not through The Hague, which many now viewed as compromised, but through a new body based in Africa itself. The idea was radical, yet simple: an African court for global justice. Some called it naive, others called it overdue, but to millions across the continent, it felt inevitable, the logical conclusion of a century of external exploitation and moral hypocrisy. Behind closed doors, diplomats whispered about pressure tactics, the freezing of accounts, the delaying of development funds, the quiet threats of regime change. But the Sahel governments had calculated their risk. After years of sanctions and isolation, they had little left to lose and much to gain from symbolic victory. When regional state media released images of the migrants being treated in hospitals under national protection, it changed the tone of the debate entirely. What had begun as a geopolitical scandal transformed into a moral movement. The image of a nurse giving water to a dehydrated child became the face of Africa's argument to the world that dignity cannot be outsourced. Western commentators struggled to contain the narrative. For years, they had defined Africa through the lens of dependence as a region needing guidance, governance, or rescue. But now, Africa was positioning itself as the conscience of an immoral world. Independent think tanks, such as the Institute for Security Studies ISS Africa and Chatham House Africa Program, began hosting panels titled Sovereignty and Solidarity in the Age of Migration. Academics debated whether the continent was witnessing the birth of a new non-aligned movement, one that rejected both Western paternalism and Eastern opportunism. Amid this intellectual storm, something even more significant was happening on the ground. Cooperation. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, despite limited resources, began pooling legal experts to draft what would become known as the Sovereign Migration Defense Act of Africa. The Act's stated goal was to ensure that no foreign power could transfer, detain, or relocate individuals onto African soil without transparent legal procedures approved by both domestic and continental courts. For the first time, Migration was being framed not as a humanitarian burden, but as a question of sovereign justice. The president of Burkina Faso later remarked during an African Union session, "We cannot claim independence if our borders remain open to the will of others. Sovereignty begins with a right to say no." That sentence, repeated in countless editorials and social media clips, became a rallying cry for a generation weary of invisible chains. Yet the challenges were immense. Economic retaliation loomed. Aid budgets were slashed. Foreign advisors withdrew. Critics warned that the new doctrine of sovereign migration could isolate Africa from vital humanitarian partnerships. But supporters argued that true partnership could never exist under coercion. From Nairobi to Lagos, radio talk shows buzzed with a new sense of pride. For once, Africa was setting the terms of the conversation. And as the world watched, uncertain whether to dismiss or applaud, one truth became clear. The events unfolding in the Sahel were no longer just about 300 migrants or one secret operation. They were about the rebirth of agency, the moment when a continent long spoken for began speaking for itself. The leak that was supposed to be buried had, instead, unearthed the deepest fault line in international relations, the gap between moral rhetoric and moral action. What followed next would turn that moral awakening into a global confrontation, a standoff between principle and power that would change how the world defined justice itself. For weeks, the rumor of a coming showdown hung over the international stage like a gathering storm. Leaked cables hinted that the United States and its allies were preparing a joint statement condemning the Sahel governments for destabilizing regional migration frameworks. Yet, behind the diplomatic phrasing, everyone knew what it meant. Pressure, economic and political, aimed at forcing compliance. But the Sahel capitals did not blink. On a humid morning in October, the world's media converged on Ouagadougou. Cameras pointed toward a hall draped in the flags of more than 20 African nations. Inside, under the glare of spotlights, the leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger stood shoulder to shoulder. Their expressions were unreadable, their silence deliberate. When the room finally stilled, the Burkinabè leader stepped forward and uttered a single sentence that would echo across continents. Africa will no longer outsource its conscience. It was the official announcement of the International Tribunal for Migration Justice, the ITMJ. The declaration stunned the world. Western diplomats dismissed it as symbolic theater. Analysts on major networks debated whether the court could ever hold real power. But in streets from Accra to Addis Ababa, the response was electric. Citizens poured out chanting, "Justice has a new home." The proposal detailed the creation of a trans-African judicial body authorized to investigate crimes of displacement, forced deportation, and covert relocation programs, acts traditionally overseen or ignored by global institutions in the West. Unlike the International Criminal Court, the ITMJ would operate under the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and report directly to the African Union Assembly. Legal scholars began analyzing the document line by line. At the University of Cape Town Center for Human Rights, researchers pointed out that the ITMJ could fill the vacuum left by a discredited ICC, whose prosecutions had overwhelmingly targeted Africans. Professor Chukwuma Okonkwo wrote in African Affairs Review that this marks the first time a regional bloc has attempted to build a judicial architecture capable of holding even global powers morally accountable. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. In Western capitals, official silence gave way to subtle retaliation. Investment conferences were postponed. Visas for Sahel officials were quietly revoked. Multilateral banks reevaluated risk exposure. And then came the statement that confirmed every suspicion. A leaked memo from a foreign policy task force describing the Sahel governments as non-compliant partners and recommending strategic containment. But far from intimidating them, the leak emboldened the movement. African newspapers republished a memo with fiery editorials titled Containment or Independence and The West's Last Leash. Radio hosts reminded listeners that containment was the same word used in colonial memoranda a century earlier. Meanwhile, civil society groups across the continent, lawyers, teachers, students began raising funds for the fledgling tribunal. Within a month, more than $40 million had been pledged, much of it from small individual donations. Diaspora communities in London, Paris, and Toronto organized benefit concerts. Afrobeat musicians released songs celebrating the Exodus defiance. But the confrontation reached its peak when the United Nations convened a special session in Geneva. Officially, the topic was migration and global stability. Unofficially, everyone knew the real subject was Africa's rebellion against the old order. Representatives of the Sahel bloc arrived dressed in traditional fabrics instead of Western suits. They sat together, defiantly at the front. When the chair gave the floor to the Sahel delegation, the room fell silent. The Burkinabè foreign minister began slowly, her voice steady. For decades, our nations have been lectured about responsibility, while others practice impunity. We have buried children in deserts created by policies we did not write. We have been told to obey rules that never protected us. No longer. Operation Exodus was not a mistake, it was a mirror. It showed us who we are to them, and who we can be to ourselves. The chamber erupted half applause, half uproar. Western ambassadors exchanged tense whispers. Others simply stared, aware that history was tilting beneath their feet. Moments later, an unexpected intervention shifted the atmosphere further. A representative from South America requested the floor. Speaking for a coalition of developing nations, he said, "What Africa demands today, we demanded yesterday. The right to justice cannot be patented by geography." Applause thundered. Asia-Pacific delegates nodded. The room no longer belonged to its old masters. That day, journalists described the mood as post-colonial lightning. For the first time, the world's marginalized majority saw a path toward shared moral sovereignty. Back in Africa, the momentum became tangible. Construction began on a temporary ITMJ campus outside Bamako, funded jointly by member states and private African foundations. Courtrooms were designed to broadcast proceedings publicly, ensuring transparency. The tribunal's charter explicitly banned secret evidence and prohibited the detention of any individual without regional consent, a direct rebuke to clandestine methods of Operation Exodus. At the same time, evidence from whistleblowers and humanitarian organizations began piling up. Former contractors leaked flight manifests, cargo logs, and encrypted communications. A declassified snippet from a European intelligence exchange confirmed that Category Z flights had been approved for rapid transfer of denationalized persons, bureaucratic language for human cargo. International opinion began to fracture. Influential columnists in Le Monde and the Washington Post demanded explanations. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights quietly opened a fact-finding mission. Even some voices in the U.S. Congress called for transparency hearings, worried that America's moral authority abroad was collapsing. For the African public, vindication felt both triumphant and sobering. Yes, they had forced the world to listen, but they also glimpsed the cost of independence. Investment dried up. Foreign aid pipelines slowed to a trickle. In several countries, inflation spiked. Yet public opinion polls conducted by Afrobarometer revealed something unexpected. Overwhelming support for Stand. More than 70% of respondents across the Sahel said they would accept economic hardship if it meant retaining dignity and sovereignty. One commentator on Senegal's RTS News put it bluntly, "Better hunger with honor than bread with chains." The story reached its emotional peak when footage emerged from a children's march in Ouagadougou. Hundreds of students carried handmade signs reading, "People are not leverage." One girl, no more than 9, held a cardboard cutout shaped like Africa, painted gold, with the words "Justice lives here." That image went viral. Newspapers from Nairobi to New York printed it. Commentators called her the child who spoke for a continent. In later interviews, she said she had painted the sign herself because she wanted the world to stop throwing people away. Her innocence turned defiance into compassion, reframing the political fight as a moral awakening. From that moment, even critics admitted the movement could not be contained by sanctions or propaganda. It had become something larger, a cultural rebirth, an assertion of identity. As weeks passed, the ITMJ held its inaugural hearing, a symbolic session reviewing testimony from migrants who had survived Operation Exodus. Their stories were harrowing: families separated, documents destroyed, promises broken. But the tone of the session was not vengeance, it was restoration. Judges spoke of dignity, of healing, of moral reconstruction. In the closing statement, one magistrate declared, "Justice begins when the invisible are seen." That line was replayed endlessly on African media, carved into murals, printed on shirts, quoted in songs. It crystallized what the movement stood for: not revenge against the powerful, but redemption for the powerless. In the capitals of Europe and America, the old powers were forced into reflection. Some doubled down on denial. Others, privately, began exploring dialogue. But one fact could no longer be ignored: Africa had changed. And as the world stared at that change, one question echoed across every newsroom, embassy, and living room. If justice can be born in the Sahel, what else can be reborn there? The world moves fast, but certain moments refuse to fade. The night the first ITMJ session streamed live from Bamako, millions watched across Africa. In cafes, homes, and town squares, people stared at their screens not to see power punished, but to witness dignity restored. For the first time in decades, justice did not look like a foreign courtroom, it looked like home. News anchors in Europe tried to frame it as an African response to an African crisis. But they missed the point. This was not reaction, it was creation. A continent writing its own moral code after centuries of being written about by others. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had done more than resist a covert operation. They had ignited a philosophical rebellion. They had said no to a world order that measures human worth by passport color and dead history. They had told the global powers that moral hierarchy is over, that the child of Sahel is no less human than the child of Silicon Valley. And somewhere between the rhetoric of sanctions and the silence of diplomacy, something profound shifted. The conversation about sovereignty became the conversation about humanity. Economists debated the impact. Politicians measured the cost. But on the ground, ordinary people measure something else: hope. In border towns once known for migration outflows, construction projects began. Cooperatives formed to produce food locally. The idea was simple yet radical. If dignity can't be imported, then neither should dependence. At night, community radio stations broadcast recordings of Traoré's speech to the UN, looping the phrase that had become the anthem of a generation: "People are not leverage." It was painted on buses, whispered in classrooms, chanted in stadiums. To the rest of the world, it was defiance. To Africans, it was rebirth. Even as Western governments maneuvered to regain influence through back channels, internal discussions began to change. Analysts in Washington and Brussels warned that Africa's shift was not ideological, it was existential. It wasn't about rejecting the West. It was about redefining the terms of partnership. The age of unquestioned compliance, wrote The Economist, is ending. That realization did not come from military might or political cunning. It came from moral clarity, from the refusal of a small, landlocked nation to accept the unacceptable. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as a pawn in global strategy, had become the compass of a new moral geography. In Ouagadougou, murals of children holding maps of Africa spread across walls. The ITMJ headquarters began to attract delegations from Asia and Latin America, eager to learn from its model. And soon, quiet negotiations began for treaties that would link justice systems across the global south, creating what activists called the new circle of accountability. Meanwhile, documentaries and investigative pieces poured out from Al Jazeera to independent African outlets, unpacking the story behind Operation Exodus. They traced the money trails, the defense contracts, the diplomatic cover-ups. But what captivated audiences most wasn't the scandal, it was the courage. One documentary featured a Burkinabè officer who had been present that night when a mysterious plane landed. His words were calm, yet unshakable. "I realized that we were standing at the edge of history. If we accepted those people without question, we would never again have the right to question anything." That statement summed up the entire movement, the idea that sovereignty is not just a political boundary, it's a moral boundary. Even as time moved forward, the ripples continued. The African Union adopted the Sovereign Migration Defense Act, making it illegal for any African nation to accept foreign deportations without legal consent. Across the continent, young lawyers volunteered to join the ITMJ's legal corps. For the first time, Africa wasn't just participating in international law, it was rewriting it. And then came the most symbolic gesture of all. On the anniversary of the leaked Operation Exodus documents, a coalition of 37 African states voted unanimously to request a UN inquiry into covert deportation practices worldwide. The resolution passed not by power, but by pressure, moral and collective. It was a message not only to Washington, but to the entire world. Accountability is not a Western export. The same night, in a televised address watched by millions, President Traoré spoke from the steps of the National Assembly. The rain fell hard, the lights flickered, but his voice cut through. We are not against nations. We are against the idea that nations can own people. Our independence means nothing if it does not protect a human being, every human being. Those words travel farther than any trade route. They became the quote cited by universities, reposted by activists, studied in think tanks. Because beneath the politics lay a universal truth. Every struggle for sovereignty begins as a struggle for humanity. And so, the story of Operation Exodus, once meant to humiliate, became the story of Africa's awakening. It showed that resistance is not only about armies or sanctions, but about values, about knowing what cannot be bought, borrowed, or dictated. Today, when historians revisit this moment, they might describe it as a diplomatic crisis or a turning point in migration policy. But for those who lived it, it was something simpler, a moral correction, a moment when a continent looked at itself and said, we decide who we are, because in the end, every empire falls not when it loses its wealth, but when it loses its moral argument. And for the first time in modern history, Africa was not just part of someone else's story, it was the author. As the credits of history begin to roll on this chapter, one thing is clear. This was never just about a shipment, a speech, or a scandal. It was about the right to exist with dignity, the courage to refuse humiliation, and the quiet conviction that no one can be free until everyone is free. And that, perhaps, is the real legacy of the Sahel's defiance. To the viewer watching now, wherever you are, the story asks something of you. Don't just watch. Think, discuss. Ask yourself, who decides what justice looks like? Who decides what humanity costs? And when you answer, remember the lesson written not in textbooks, but in the sands of Sahel. Justice begins when the invisible are seen.